There was blood coming through the apartment down the hallway. The blood trail continued out of the front door.
People experience jealousy in a series of emotions. Because you were jealous of these things, you did this.
That definitely set him off. He's not in a world where he has a lot of positive relationship. He's kind of left up to his own devices, and his own devices was guns and anger.
Ultimately, this was a collision course that was destined to happen unless somebody stepped in.
On December 31st of 2009, I was working patrol in the city of Burien. And around 9:30 at night, dispatch toned out a call of a shooting that had just occurred.
911, what are you reporting?
I need an ambulance.
And you need an ambulance?
Yes, please.
We have a shooting.
Please don't do this to me, baby.
The caller is so upset she isn't able to provide a lot of details. Deputies immediately race to the address.
It's a two-story apartment, but it's only probably 10, maybe 12 units total. So 6 downstairs, 6 upstairs.
Arriving at a scene like this, you're very cautious because you don't know exactly what you're getting yourself into. So with that, we had stopped on the roadway so that we could get a view of the apartment from a relatively safe distance, and if the shooter was still in the area and potentially looking to start shooting at us, our cars could afford us some cover. Once we had at least another 2 or 3 officers at the scene, we made the decision that we needed to go into the apartment where this shooting had occurred. When we entered into sort of a living room, kitchen area, and there was a short hallway that went back to a bathroom and 2 bedrooms on the back side of the apartment. We did not find anybody in the apartment until Deputy Smithmeyer and I entered one of the back bedrooms. We found a young female face down.
She was small in stature. She was a teenager, you could tell, just by looking at her.
The 911 caller tells dispatch the victim's name is Mykara Sanders, and she's only 15.
It was quite obvious that she had been shot on the left side of her face in the cheek area. It was a very significant wound. There was a fair amount of blood on the covers of the bed, and she was laying partially face down. Deputy Smithmeyer tried to find a pulse on the young lady, and he told me, I can't get a pulse.
So I started to do CPR. She was aspirating a lot of blood out of her nose and out of the hole in her cheek. I think between myself and Deputy Ostrom, we continued CPR for several minutes until aid got there.
Mykara Sanders was born in 1994 in Seattle, Washington.
Mykara was just social. She was a good baby. She didn't hardly cry. She just was easy to get along with. And so that's how Mykara was growing up. She was always smiling, having fun, laughing, and, just being that bright person in the room.
Mykara, her personality was the biggest and best thing about her. She was very bubbly. She would just make you happy being around her because that's the energy she would bring.
Mykara's father was not in the picture, so her grandmother helped raise her along with her brother and sister. It was a loving home, but with strict rules.
I went to Mykara's grandma's house for the first time shortly after we met, and I had a graphic t-shirt on with a skull or something on it. She's like, oh no, you can't walk in here with that. Zip your jacket up. My grandma's not having that. We're not raised like that. You can't wear that.
She had a super support structure. It wasn't just our village and our family. It was just so much broader. She would have these friends and these people that anywhere she went, it was always, my Kara wanting to be exposed to new people, new things, and trying different things for her life.
My Kara, I think, had a genuine love for people. She was really involved with church with her grandmother. She comes from a very spiritually centered home.
Faith was such an important part of my Kara's life that when she was 13, she went on her first missionary trip with her grandmother.
They went a few places, but their main place was in India because they were going to build school and church for the people of this village. And this was right after the earthquake that triggered the major tsunami over there. They were gone for about a month and a half doing missionary work, building that church and building that school.
She talked so much about that trip. And I think that experience is where that dedication to service came from.
My Kara came home to Washington State, determined to continue helping the less fortunate. She began to volunteer for an after-school program designed to keep kids away from drugs and street life.
Part of the programming that we did was around volunteerism and getting young people engaged in service. And I knew I could always count on her for that.
My Kara made a lot of friends volunteering, but high school was a different story.
My understanding is that my Kara was going to a school doing well academically and ran into somebody that was a bully. And in dealing with this other young lady, she ended up having to go to another school.
Changing schools is never easy for a teenager, but my Kara met a young man at the new school who made it worthwhile. His name was Matthew Du Bois.
With Matthew and my Kara, it was like the good girl attracted to the bad boy.
The environment that Matthew grew up in was one that was dangerous, not only to him, but other kids his age. They grew up in an area where lives are often cut shorter, and they're brutal and they're violent, and the fear of death via murder is present. Matthew, like many others, was a young man that's just trying to navigate a very brutal environment. She saw the best in Matthew and what his possibilities were, and clearly she was attracted to him as somebody that she wanted to date.
My Kara has this thing about her. It's a gift she's had. She likes to save people and love people. And I think she viewed Matthew as someone who had been underserved and underloved, and that because she had met him, it was suddenly her job to prove and show this love that I know she could see very clearly that he didn't have.
It didn't take long for my Kara to fall in love. When she wasn't studying or volunteering, she was with Matthew.
She was very loyal and made sure that she went above and beyond for him. She would always be there getting them food, getting them stuff. She had this unmatched loyalty, like right or wrong, she's gonna be there for you. And that's what I think he's seen and admired in her.
New Year's Eve 2009 marked the couple's 6th month together. So my Kara wanted it to be special, but their celebration turned into a nightmare instead. My Kara is clinging to life after an unexplained shooting, but investigators quickly discover there's more to the story.
When we left the apartment and secured it, there were several other deputies on scene, and I noticed that there was a lot of activity just upstairs from where we were.
While authorities were responding to my Kara's shooting, another call came in. My Kara isn't the only victim.
Please, the young man's been shot. Somebody's collapsing, please.
All right, what's the young man's name?
Matthew.
The caller lives in the apartment upstairs. She says that minutes earlier, the victim stumbled to her door with a gunshot wound.
He's bleeding and catching on the stomach side. Something else. I don't know. I can't believe it happened.
There was blood coming through the apartment down the hallway towards the front door. And when you walked out of the front door, The blood trail continued around to the stairway that led upstairs to where the young man was with the gunshot to his shoulder.
The second victim is Micara's boyfriend, 16-year-old Matthew Du Bois. Desperately to stabilize Matthew Du Bois and Micara Sanders after a New Year's Eve shooting, police question the woman who made the first 911 call. She tells them she's the girlfriend of Matthew's older brother. The apartment where they were shot is the Du Bois family residence.
The female that had been in the lower apartment where the shooting occurred had stated that she had been over there due to the fact that they were getting together for New Year's.
They're all in the apartment together. She ends up leaving this apartment because she had been calling her boyfriend and he wasn't answering. She leaves this apartment and runs to her grandmother's apartment, which is right in the same complex, and tries to call him from that number, hoping that he will answer. She says she knew her grandma was home, but her grandmother didn't answer. While she's about to knock again, she says she hears a loud bang. At this point, she heads back downstairs to see exactly what happened because she heard the boom and it sounded like it came from her apartment. As she's heading downstairs to go to her apartment, she claimed to police that she saw a black male running from the apartment. And it was someone she didn't recognize. She says that she hears Matthew calling for help, and she runs in and she sees Matthew holding his shoulder and he's bleeding profusely. And Matthew apparently kept repeating that they ran in the house, they ran in the house. Knowing that Matthew's been shot, she then goes to look for Micara. She looks for Micara inside the house and she finds her inside the room and she's lying in a pool of blood. She calls 911. She was asked during this interview, what did the suspect look like? What did you see? And she said she didn't see much. She saw this black male running from the scene and he had short black hair and she described him as short.
The woman says she has no idea who the man was or why he shot Matthew and Micara. Deputies take a closer look at the Du Bois' apartment to see if they can find any clues.
It looked like the furniture was out of place. Like it wasn't very tidy, but it was more than that. It was more like a struggle had ensued of some sort or a fight or something.
In a scene like this, we're not going to start digging through a bunch of stuff because there is going to be a search warrant that is going to need to be procured for the detectives. Basically, ours was just a cursory view of the apartment to see if we did, in plain view, notice a gun sitting somewhere or any other items that we felt would have evidentiary value. At that point, neither of us had seen a gun. The only thing that we did notice is what appeared to be a bullet hole in that door.
Unfortunately, nothing they find helps identify the shooter. For that, they need to talk to the victims, and only Matthew is conscious.
After some time of the paramedics working on Micara, they were able to stabilize her to the point that they could get her loaded up in an ambulance and transport her to hospital.
At this stage, it's critical to try to talk to Matthew and get as much information from him as possible before he goes off to the hospital because he could be incapacitated. He could die from his injuries, but you want to get some information out of him about a possible suspect. So they go over to talk to Matthew, and as they're talking to him, Matthew says that a suspect came in and he described him as a black male with a blue bandana and shot him and his girlfriend from across the room.
He was seen with a blue bandana, which was insinuating potentially that he was part of a gang.
With Matthew Du Bois' description of the gunman who attacked him and his girlfriend, Micara Sanders, deputies search the surrounding area. It hasn't been long since the shooting occurred, so he might still be in the neighborhood.
Being that it was New Year's Eve, there were a lot of people having get-togethers and parties at their apartments. So one of the things that we did is a lot of deputies went around and knocked on apartments to talk to people, stop people in the street, ask them, did you hear anything? Did you see anything unusual? And we couldn't come across anybody that was aware of something taking place or seeing somebody running from that apartment complex. We had a canine officer who had arrived on the scene, and he had tried for a track of the suspect, and that track was unsuccessful. The dog just wasn't indicating on anything to give us an idea of where the suspect potentially had fled to.
As the search continues, investigators turn their attention to the second 911 caller, the grandmother who lives in the apartment upstairs.
She's telling detectives that Matthew came, knocked on her door, and he had this gunshot wound, and that was when she got involved.
She claims she had been home all night, and there had been no knock on her door before Matthew's.
At this point, detectives are getting concerned because the story's not adding up.
The woman's granddaughter, the first 911 caller, told investigators she had knocked earlier.
There was the realization that things weren't jiving. It was decided at that time that they would try to get some clarification on those things that were not, the pieces weren't fitting together the same way.
Detectives take the first caller to the station for further questioning. At the hospital, Mycara's loved ones are waiting for news of her condition.
Matthew was in surgery, so the waiting room for Matthew was downstairs. Mycara was upstairs, and I didn't understand why at that time, but I know that I was trying to get to Mycara, so we were asking the doctors, can we see Mycara? How's Mycara?
The head surgeon, when she came into my waiting room, I was already on my knees praying and crying for her life to be spared. So when she came in, I didn't even see this woman's face. I seen her walk in the room. And it's just like these things. I don't know. I knew she didn't have nothing good to tell me.
The surgeon explains they've done everything they can, but the bullet did too much damage.
Her machines that were hooked up to her organs started beeping and going off. We agreed to let her go peacefully.
Just before 2 a.m. on January 1st, 2010, Mycara Sanders is taken off life support. She dies in her mother's arms.
I was at peace because I knew what had happened to her was causing her extreme pain that she had never felt before. But I was very angry because something was stolen and ripped from me that I knew I could never get back.
I just broke down. I just started bawling. Felt like my heart was pulled out of my chest. I'm like, there's no way. Like, there's absolutely no way.
Later that morning, detectives come by to talk to Zakiya Sanders to see if she knows of anyone who'd want to hurt her daughter. She says Mycara was helping troubled kids at a local teen center and worries it might have gotten her involved with some dangerous people.
Mycara did live a very structured and sheltered life. We accounted for all the activities of her day. Being at the teen center with these other children, I just think that they kind of, gave her that opportunity to do something a little different and a little more than what she had been experiencing, and that the reward was going to be a good time and excitement.
Her independence had evolved. I think she was trying to really figure out, as a young adult, what freedoms do I have? Which way can I go? And, who do I want to be around?
Zakiya says she's been particularly concerned about her daughter's relationship with Matthew Du Bois.
She knows that I didn't approve of certain behaviors, and she knows that I didn't approve of certain activities for her age, and that I was very strict and very disciplined about what and how I wanted her to be exposed to the outside world. We weren't raised with young women, especially that were unwed, having boyfriends. That was not a standard for conduct that was gonna be tolerated within our family.
My Kara was caught between worlds, for sure. And we would have these conversations all the time. She understood that some of the things that she was doing wasn't really reflecting how she was brought up.
The relationship that they were trying to form was not gonna be approved by any elder in her community. So he had to be her secret, and that he was.
Authorities also discover another reason Mykera kept Matthew a secret. He has a criminal record, including charges of burglary and illegal possession of a firearm.
Without question, Matthew had been in trouble. He had been in trouble before he ever met Mykera. He was in alternative school for a reason. He had been in and out of juvenile detention for a reason. And he was on electronic home detention on December 31st, 2009, when Mykera visits him.
I hope she didn't catch a bullet behind this man. I hope she didn't try to stand in front of him and try to protect him for somebody he's fighting.
So far, investigators have conflicting stories about what happened the night Mykera Sanders was killed, and little physical evidence to go on. But that's about to change.
The next day when I came in to work, I had heard that the deputy that relieved us, while he was standing outside of the apartment, was just kind of looking around and happened to see a gun tucked kind of under some bushes by a stairwell, I believe. And so they were able to recover that for evidence.
That gun ended up being a .357 Magnum that had 2 rounds still inside the chamber that were expended. It was also blood on the barrel of that gun.
Authorities send samples of the blood to the lab for DNA testing. Mykera's autopsy provides other important pieces of evidence.
And the medical examiner confirms that she passed away from a gunshot wound to her cheek. They were able to retrieve a bullet from her, and now that bullet can be compared to the weapon that was recovered from the scene.
The medical examiner also finds gunpowder marks on Mykera's skin.
They were able to determine that this was a close-range gunshot wound where the gun was literally pressed against her face. What this was able to tell detectives is this killer didn't shoot from across the room. This killer walked into this apartment, walked across the apartment, navigated through and into this bedroom, and shot Mykera.
That means either Matthew's memory is incorrect or he's not telling the truth. Unfortunately, he's still sedated after surgery, so they'll have to wait to question him further. Instead, detectives have another talk with the witness who confirmed his story.
So they bring back in the first 911 caller, who was the young lady who was dating Matthew's brother.
It was decided at that time that they would try to get some clarification on those things that were not, the pieces weren't fitting together the same way.
When she learns about Mykera's death, the woman suddenly changes her statement.
She now says Matthew had a gun that evening. It was a revolver. That's also key because that was found outside. Says he was planning to fire it off that evening for the New Year's Eve celebration. She also said that he was playing around with it while in the apartment, making it go clip by pulling the trigger. So the story that she's telling detectives at this point is that she's sitting on her couch, Mykera and Matthew are also in there, and then they go to the back bedroom. She says she hears a boom, and then she runs upstairs to her grandmother's apartment. And that's when they call police. But detectives at this point aren't falling for it anymore. They confront her again and tell her, your grandmother already came off the truth and told us that Matthew was the first person there. And they confront her with this information.
Clearly shaken, the woman revises her story yet again.
This story now is that she hears the gunshot and Matthew calls for help. She goes in and Matthew says, I accidentally shot Makira while I was playing with my gun. Matthews then says, call the police and tell them somebody ran in here and shot us. He then shoots himself in the shoulder. And she says, that's when I called 911. Detectives aren't stupid. They know something's off with this. They tell her, look, it's up. If you're not gonna be honest with us, we're gonna charge you with accessory to murder.
Finally, the witness decides to come clean. She admits that she's been lying to protect Matthew because she's afraid of what he might do if she doesn't.
She tells him, I'm scared because Matthew is involved in criminal activity. The gang stuff, the stop snitching stuff, I'm scared. She tells him that most of what she had been saying was true, but there were key details that she was leaving out because she was in fear. And she tells the full story of what happened and how it went down.
Welcome to all childhood. He's not in a world where he has a lot of positive relationships. He's not in a world where he is being groomed and trained on how to deal with conflict and how you deal with that in a healthy way. So he's kind of left up to his own devices, and his own devices was guns and anger. That's part of who he is and how he shows up in our world.
Now claims that Matthew Du Bois is the one who shot Makira Sanders and says it all started over jealousy.
She tells him that Matthew and Makira got into an argument about a social media app that Makira had gotten a message on. Matthew had been accusing her of cheating, and this grows and escalates, and they go into this back bedroom. She says she hears this argument going on, and then the loud bang.
The woman tells investigators Matthew shot himself, then ran out of the apartment with the gun. She doesn't know what he did with it after that.
Was this a jealous boyfriend? Was this rage? Was this truly an accident? That's what detectives have to now figure out, because they've kind of pieced this story together where it looks like Matthew is the killer, and he did this. Why did he do it is now the question.
But to get answers to these questions, investigators will have to get Matthew to talk.
Matthew is at the hospital recovering from surgery, and detectives go back to re-interview him. He does not know Makira has passed away at this point. When they start to interview him, he's given very short answers, asking him questions like, what happened? I got shot. Where did it happen? My apartment.
His next answer is a stunner.
Who were you with? My girl, that bitch. Who calls a girl that you're with that bitch at that moment? Normally not a victim. Detectives confront him with this information that they have and tell him to stop with the lying, stop with the drama that you're giving us, because we know what happened. We've gotten more information while you have been in the hospital. And Matthew says, okay, we were in an argument, we got into some pushing and shoving, and it was over some social media stuff because I thought she was cheating on me.
According to Matthew, the message was from Makira's ex-boyfriend. He says he didn't tell them about it earlier because he knew it would make him look guilty.
Matthew claims that this argument got heated and he went to cool off because he asked her to leave and she wouldn't leave. And while he was in the process of cooling off, he hears this gunshot and he sees this 5'8" guy with this blue bandana from a possible rival gang running out of the apartment. And that's the story that he's choosing to stick with at this point.
But detectives have several reasons to believe Matthew is lying. One of them is the fact that at no point during their questioning does he bother to ask about Makira.
That's not normal. That's not what a normal person in a situation like that does. Normally a person says, well, how are they? What's going on? In this scenario, Matthew doesn't know that his girlfriend is dead, but he does know that she was injured severely, and he doesn't ask how she is.
Micara's loved ones don't believe his story either. They tell detectives she never would have cheated on Matthew. But he was right about one thing. She wanted out of the relationship.
It was like a roller coaster, and she was coming down. She wanted to get away from the lifestyle that she had created with the relationship with Matthew. It was just becoming too much for her. She wasn't satisfied or happy anymore, and she wanted to leave.
She was aware that she was in over her head, and this was not going to be a situation she could love away, and that him changing his thoughts, patterns, behaviors, and decision was way beyond her pay grade. I just believe because of the amount of time that he had access to her, that he kind of viewed her at the end of the relationship as kind of like his possession. And when he was threatened with the possibility that he may lose something so precious to him, I think it made him make some decisions and choices about if or how that was going to happen.
Given their history, it's easy to see how a message from Micara's ex on New Year's Eve could have pushed Matthew to a vengeful place.
Just the intention of leaving him was going to be a problem. But then for him to find out that what he believes the reason is that you want to leave now is another boy, oh, that definitely set him off.
But Micara wasn't even interested in the other guy.
The message was just a general message of invitation to a New Year's Eve gathering from one of her other young male friends. They had started arguing about it. Because you have to also understand, too, he was tethered to his home. He was on home detention. So he didn't have the freedom to get up and move around and be social on this day. He felt like he was losing her. And I feel like in the midst of that conflict that he did what he knows how to do, and he reverted back to his normal, unnatural behavior, and that is to use violence with conflict resolution. And through the course of that argument, Matthew stopped using his words to resolve this conflict and picked up his gun and shot my daughter in the face.
The question is, will prosecutors be able to prove it? After Micara Sanders was shot to death, forensic results on the evidence collected comes back from the lab.
They were able to get the forensic evidence that was needed, matching the blood that was on the gun to Micara. They were also able to match that slug that was recovered from her to the .357 that was recovered at the scene.
Although Matthew's prints are not on the gun, prosecutors believe he's the one who fired it.
By the time the first 48 hours was up, they had a case for second-degree murder against Matthew. And they handcuffed him to his hospital bed and charged him. So he went from Harborview to the juvenile.
Witness testimony and forensic evidence gives prosecutors a strong case against Matthew Du Bois. They informed the court they planned to try him as an adult, despite the fact that he was only 16 at the time of the shooting. Micara's mother, Zakiya Sanders, attends every preliminary hearing.
There were court dates where I saw Matthew, and I was very conflicted when I saw Matthew. Part of me wanted to nail him to the cross like the monster he had shown me he was, and then the other part of me was a parent. I understood in parenthood that when you don't parent your children to a certain degree, they're not capable of certain things. And so I knew that a lot of these things that were aspects surrounding the murder, like carrying guns, hanging out on the streets, having conflicts, and using guns for conflict resolution, he had kind of been familiar with and used to. And that was really unfortunate for a child to be involved in such things.
Matthew faces the possibility of spending the rest of his life in jail, but the case never goes to trial.
Behind the scenes, the prosecutor was talking to the defense attorneys. They were evaluating the nature of the witnesses that were present, the forensic information that was present. After several months of negotiation behind closed doors and several hearings that were continued, Matthew entered a plea agreement. He entered what's called an Alford plea. An Alford plea essentially says that while I believe I am innocent, I believe the facts are such that a jury would likely find me guilty. I think that an Alford plea would be difficult for any victim to actually hear in a case, principally because you want to hear somebody admit or acknowledge that they did it or be convicted by a jury.
Matthew took an Alford plea against my wishes and the family's wishes. And as the parent, that was a slap in my face because I wanted to hear the details. I wanted to understand how it came to murder. There's been so many different stories said, so many he said, she said, and even after reading Discovery, only have a general idea of kind of what happened. But I wanted to know the fine details. I wanted to know what was the last conversation like, what was she talking about, and things like that.
Despite the deal, Matthew still faces up to 22 years in prison. On October 17th, 2011, he goes before a judge for sentencing. The defense acknowledges that Matthew killed Mykara, but insists it was an accident.
I think that he probably had went through her phone. They was arguing with the phone. The gun was somewhere nearby. He grabbed it, was like, acting or whatever, trying to intimidate her, because I heard the girl that was in the house say that she heard her say, stop playing, and then boom, the gun went off.
Prosecutors still believe it was an act of revenge.
All of this started with a MySpace post. A MySpace post in which another young man actually invited Mykara to hang out on New Year's Eve with him instead of Matthew. The state's theory ultimately was that Matthew became enraged and he did something that was unspeakable. He shot her. And then he shot himself to try to cover it up.
I don't know that I ever thought that I would hear that MySpace would ever be the reason that a young person lost their life.
Matthew is sentenced to 13 years and 9 months. He is released after serving just 10 years.
That was another slap in the face because I at least wanted him to do, at the least amount, the age that she was at when he took her, and that was 15 years. Plus, this was not his first felony. 13 3/4 was just not justice. It didn't make you feel like you received justice. You just kind of take it so that you can somewhat move on with your life and have a little bit of closure.
Anytime a young person is charged with a crime and found guilty and a sentence is imposed, I think that we all need to look in the mirror. And we all need to reflect upon how we got to that place and how our system failed. He took something that he could never give back and never fully repay.
I have tons of pictures of Mykara, and so I look at them and wonder where she would be if she was able to spend the rest of her life pursuing her goals, and who she would have been. What choices would she have made? Singing and just being artistic was really a passion of hers. Would she have become a singer? Would she have been maybe a songwriter? Like, what experiences would she have taken from her youth to become the adult that she was destined to be? So yes, I think about Mykara all the time.
I love her, and I will always speak life into her, and her legacy will never die as long as there's breath in my body.
Every aspect of your life is changed when someone this close to you is murdered. You do not figure out until they are gone the void spaces that they leave behind.
Few cities have achieved the cultural and economic influence of New York. It's celebrated as a melting pot of different races, creeds, and cultures. But throughout its history, New York's diversity has also been the source of its greatest conflict. In the 1980s, race relations were at an all-time low. The city was a powder keg poised to explode. And the arrest of 5 Black and Latinx teens from Harlem would provide the match to set it off. New York City was colonized in 1624, when the Dutch West India Trading Company sent 30 families to form a settlement along the banks of the Hudson River. It would initially be known as New Amsterdam.
Even from the beginning, when the Dutch colonized this part of the world, New York was one of the most diverse places in the world. It was a natural harbor, a natural port. This is why, from the very beginning, New York became center of the Atlantic world.
African slaves were brought to New York in 1626. And over the next 100 years, almost half of New York households had become slave owners. Emancipation followed in the 1800s, but this newfound freedom did little to bring equality or acceptance.
What always boggles my mind is slaves weren't feared in slavery, right? They were docile. They were intentionally kept docile through pain and torture. But after they had to free us, they made us out to be these violent monsters. There's been centuries of propaganda put out to make Black people seem like a threat.
Because of that fear, newly freed Black New Yorkers weren't allowed in certain parts of the city. For decades to come, they were segregated into places like Harlem, Brownsville, Bed-Stuy, and the Bronx.
New York City has 5 boroughs. Each of those boroughs, there are neighborhoods where it's just white people who live. And then there are neighborhoods where just Hispanic people live. And then there are neighborhoods where just Asian people live. And there are neighborhoods where Black people live. And so at that time, there was very few intermingling.
Over time, the city would become home to one of the largest Black populations in the United States. But despite the growing number of Black New Yorkers, jobs and basic resources were historically scarce in Black communities.
And in some neighborhoods, there is this sense of dread and despair. And if you look at pictures of certain neighborhoods in the Bronx, you see blocks and blocks of burnt out, abandoned buildings.
You don't have any money. You don't have any material objects. You lack food, decent food, access to food.
Many scholars call it the dual city, where basically you have an affluent population and then a very low-income population, and the two don't meet in any way or form.
The 1970s and 80s were particularly hard on Black communities, and many believe these were the most difficult decades for Black New Yorkers in the city's modern history.
In those days, there was this sense that people didn't care about these poor neighborhoods. And so because of that mindset, then the people themselves, the younger people, that's why they turned to the selling drugs.
You look at the Bronx, you look at Harlem, you look at parts of Brooklyn, where the drug trade was heavy and there was violence. And these were really sad times.
Even though drugs permeated throughout the city, no matter rich or poor, young Black men received most of the blame for drug-related crimes.
There was this sort of, theme, narrative, whatever you want to call it, that a lot of this crime was committed by people of color. And so there was this undercurrent of racism.
Hispanic communities also became frequent targets of police crackdowns and arrests.
The focus was placed on the drug abuse in poor Black and Latinx communities. And the problem with that is the evidence shows that the abuse of drugs doesn't take place at a greater rate in Black or Latinx communities as compared to white communities.
City leaders wasted no time implementing strict law and order policies that targeted minority communities, including the NYPD's infamous stop and frisk tactics.
What we found is that when there is a spike or where there is issues, people just want to see something done. It actually doesn't matter if it makes them safer or not. So it's easier to say we need to send more police to these communities. And if that doesn't work, we probably need to send some more police because the ones we sent wasn't enough.
The police operated in a very strange way. On the one hand, productivity was very low, especially in these minority neighborhoods. But police brutality was very high.
The catch-all to the failings of many institutions. Instead of funding those institutions or to just send more police, and these communities, they get stuck between real street violence, which we want to address, and over-policing.
As New York's jails began to fill with young Black and Hispanic men, the stage was being set for a cultural war. And one incident was all it would take to explode. Wednesday, April 19th, 1989. It's just after dark when the NYPD switchboard lights up with reports of a group of teenagers rampaging through Central Park.
It was right before spring break, for schools, for the public schools. And a lot of kids were out that night.
What you had happen this night was you had some teenagers that decided to go into the park and just wreak havoc. They were just accosting whoever they saw, And so over the course of several hours in the evening, they beat people up, and they were trying to take people's possessions.
In response, several squads of officers rush in to restore order.
As the evening progressed, the police did round up a few folks, but a lot of these young people, they found their way out of the park into their homes.
Peace seems to have been restored and the damage kept to a minimum, but nothing could have been further from the truth.
It was around 1:30 in the morning following this night of chaos when a group of people were just going through a stroll in the park like thousands of people do in New York City every single day in Central Park. And as they were walking around this one area, they heard what they thought were the sounds of somebody moaning. And upon further investigation, they walked off the pavement onto the grass and they made their way towards, they could see the outline of somebody lying on the ground and they could see a woman who appeared to be badly beaten, and so they called authorities.
Officers arrived to find an unconscious white woman, bound and gagged, wearing only a bra. She'd been severely beaten and raped, then left for dead.
She was taken from the park and then taken to Metropolitan Hospital from there. The reports that you got from the doctors was that she had bled out some 50 to 75% of her blood. She had been beaten about the head and face. She likely would have died had it not been for the fact that it was the early spring and the nighttime temperatures were still pretty low.
For years to come, the victim will be known only as the Central Park Jogger. But her real name is Trisha Miley.
Trisha Miley, at that time, was an investment banker working for Solomon Brothers, and she lived on the Upper East Side, which is next to East Harlem.
She lived in one of the buildings near the park, and police and investigators learned that it was her routine to go jogging in that area in Central Park several times a week. She would typically get home from her investment banking job around 8 o'clock, and she'd change from her outfit that she wore to work that day, and she'd get into her jogging gear, and she'd go for a jog.
As she set out for her run, Trisha had no reason to think that night would be any different.
Her run sometimes would take her west, and it would take her towards Harlem and into the park. So this was her habit to jog late at night. And she left home in much the same way she did on many other occasions.
This time, however, she never made it home.
She was approached from behind and basically was hit on the head with a rock, and that sent her to the pavement, and then, the assault and the beating began.
She was raped and beaten nearly to death. And it's just one of the worst things that could ever happen to her, to anyone.
Now, she's in the hospital clinging to life, and New York's finest are determined to catch whoever did this to her. They start with 5 young men arrested earlier that night.
They knew that there were a group of kids in the park. They knew that this group of kids were behaving badly. They started there.
In the 1980s, young men of color in New York City dealt with a justice system that often treated them as guilty until proven innocent.
1988 was a tough time being in New York City, particularly the Bronx and Harlem, because you had crack everywhere. There was violence everywhere. There were police who were extremely aggressive. There was this racial tension.
New York was the first state to pass no-knock legislation and also stop and frisk. After that, you begin to have more punitive legislation. Just possessing a certain amount of narcotics could land someone to prison for a long time. And most of the people who ended up in prison were African Americans and eventually Latinxes.
So on April 20th, 1989, the rape and beating of a white woman in Central Park validates all of those racial stereotypes.
Anytime you get a group of black people together, right, especially young black men together, then that's something to be afraid of.
There was this huge rush to judgment to create this connection between this large group of kids that had gathered at the entrance of the park and then the attack on the jogger.
The victim, Trisha Miley, is in a coma in East Harlem's Metropolitan Hospital. Meanwhile, police begin questioning several suspects they picked up the night before.
Law enforcement wanted a swift conclusion because this event terrified New York. This is the greatest city in the world, and back then, primarily because of this event, people were afraid to be here. So the police were in a hurry to solve the crime, but they also had some viable evidence immediately available. You had a pool of potential defendants.
5 teens are among those arrested: Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, Yusef Salam, and Corey Wise. They swiftly become the focus of the investigation.
Kevin Richardson is the youngest of the group. He's 14 years old. Raymond Santana, also 14. His dad was Puerto Rican. His mother was half black. Anton McCrae was 15 years old. He was an only child. Yusef Salam is 15 years old. His mom is a single parent. Yusef recently moved in the same building where Kevin and Corey live.
Over the course of hours of interrogation, detectives use every tactic available to put pressure on the boys.
I can appreciate that you're scared, and I can appreciate that this is a pretty sad case. But the thing that's most important is that you tell us exactly what happened. Because if you don't tell us exactly what happened, exactly what you saw, and exactly what you did, and exactly who you were with, and we find out that you were lying, it's gonna look pretty bad for you. It's gonna look like not only did you do something, but that you lied to cover it up. And then it's gonna look a lot worse.
The goal was to get a confession no matter what. Sometimes they would deprive them of food, sometimes of sleep. Sometimes if there were multiple people arrested, they would say, oh, so-and-so said this about you. Try to make them break.
Eventually, all 5 admit they touched or restrained Trisha Miley during.
This woman was first grabbed. You said you first saw her. Kevin Richardson was holding her wrists. Was he saying anything to her?
He was just trying to put her. I haven't seen that. I just seen him struggling.
First it was the black guy, then it was the Puerto Rican guy with the black hood. Then you got on top of her. Did you have your pants down when you did that?
No.
Well, when you got on top of her, you got on top of her so that you could have sex with her, right?
Not really. I just doing it so everybody know. I wasn't like really doing it.
You said you were just doing it so that everybody what?
Like everybody just know I did it.
Did you see anybody hit her with anything but their hands?
I did see Kevin pick up a hand rock, a small hand rock, and hit across the face with it.
How big was the rock?
It's a hand.
Are you just saying that because I am asking you?
No.
Why didn't you say it before?
Me taking a quick glance in the dark, I remember him picking up a rock from out the dirt.
The 5 teens are charged with sexual assault, robbery, and attempted murder. It seems the NYPD has solved the case in record time. But when the news breaks the following day, the city erupts in chaos.
Fear is a tactic that's used by everyone, and that's what New York City politicians use to try to lynch these young brothers.
Enhanced interrogation techniques like sleep deprivation are tactics usually reserved for military intelligence. But sometimes they are also used by law enforcement to break suspects and get confessions.
With so many true crime shows on TV these days, we've become accustomed to this good cop, bad cop routine, but that isn't always the case in actual interrogation of suspects. One thing the society has got to sort of recognize is that sometimes the police do cross a line with these kinds of interrogations, often soliciting information from suspects that isn't necessarily true.
The brutal assault of a 28-year-old investment banker in Central Park has the city in a panic. News of the quick arrest of 5 Black and Latinx teens does little to alleviate the fears of many white residents.
This incident, I think, terrified a lot of people. If you weren't already afraid to be in certain neighborhoods or do certain things as a young woman back then, after the Central Park case, you were.
The language that was used in the reporting in that period was oftentimes this language that incorporated animalistic terms that were used as references to the Black and Latino suspects.
The phrase that was coined was the word wilding. And so it became sort of a hiss and a byword for white folks.
The young men would eventually become known as the Central Park Five. Within New York's Black communities, their arrests result in a sense of foreboding.
You have white folks who are scared to leave their homes, and then you have Black folks who are working hard, doing a good job of raising their children, then become afraid that the police will storm into their neighborhoods.
You look at Emmett Till and the way they tortured and killed and hung and drugged. Emmett Till for allegedly whistling at a white woman, right? There's been centuries of propaganda put out to make Black people seem like a threat.
At the height of the media frenzy, Donald Trump, then just a real estate mogul, buys a scathing full-page ad in 4 of New York's most widely read newspapers.
The Trump ads were a call to bring back the death penalty. The Trump ads were a call to encourage people to hate, to seek retribution.
Really, at that point, it wasn't about justice or accountability for the act that was committed, which was a horrific act. It was more about someone has to pay, someone has to suffer.
2 weeks after her attack, Trisha Miley regains consciousness, prompting a fresh round of headlines. She has no recollection of the attack, but prosecutors are determined to move forward. In June of 1990, the first trial begins against Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, and Yusuf Salaam.
So police have tested the DNA found at the crime scene, and they've tested the DNA of the Central Park 5 suspects, and they find that that DNA from the crime scene doesn't match any of those 5. And so the defense argues at trial, we shouldn't even be here.
With no physical evidence tying the defendants to the scene, The state builds its case around the videotaped confessions.
These boys are giving explicit testimony about what had happened that night. And so for, the man of the street, for the person sitting there home watching, the police aren't wrong here. These boys confessed to committing this heinous crime.
However, the boys now take back those statements, claiming they'd been coerced by police.
But if you look at the testimony that these young boys gave, and if you look at the answers, it does strain credulity. It's hard to believe that this kind of testimony and wording could come out of these boys that night. Unless, in some form or another, it was given to them. Once the police get a statement from McCrae, they use McCrae's statement as leverage in their interrogation of the other boys. And that's what starts this cascading spiral downward into this false confession for all these boys, because they're thinking of, well, if he's saying I did this, I'm going to say he did this. Most adults know you're not going to admit to something that you haven't done. But can you put yourself in the mind of a 14, 15-year-old, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're being told all these things and you don't know what you're doing or saying, essentially?
Prosecutors refute those claims. And as far as the DNA is concerned, they say it belongs to a 6th unidentified suspect. Just because they haven't caught all of the perpetrators doesn't mean they can't convict the rest.
Whenever you have a defendant who gives a confession and then later on recants, invariably, you're going to have a prosecutor in front of a jury say, Mr. or Miss So-and-so, well, are you lying now or were you lying then? And whenever you plant that seed in a jury's mind, the person, the defendant, the one on trial, that once they're capable of lying, your defense is undermined.
The jury agrees. On August 18th, 1990, they find all 3 defendants guilty as charged. 4 months later, Kevin Richardson and Corey Wise are also convicted. The boys are sentenced to serve between 5 and 15 years in prison.
After the conviction and the sentencings were handed out, you had 2 opposite reactions here in the city. On one side, you had a group of people who were breathing a sigh of relief that apparently a gang of vicious rapists and attackers had been taken off the street. And then you had another group of people in the city who felt a grave injustice had been done here.
When they were convicted, my father looked at us and said they just lynched them, right? That was a lynching. That was a death sentence for these young brothers.
As far as most New Yorkers are concerned, the story is over. In reality, it is just beginning. In the years following the convictions of the Central Park Five, life in New York City slowly returns to normal. The victim, Trisha Miley, goes on to make a full recovery.
Remarkably, Trisha Miley is able to overcome her severe injuries, so much so that she even participates in the New York City Marathon in 1995.
Back then, nobody expected her to live. And the fact that she did is nothing short of a miracle. And it doesn't make what happened to her any better. It just makes her that much more of a symbol of God must exist because she's still here.
But for the Central Park Five, life will never be the same.
Well, the Central Park Five wind up spending many years in the penitentiary. Corey Wise, who was 16 at the time of the assault, he is charged as an adult, and of the 5, he winds up spending the most time incarcerated.
You think about these young brothers and how young and tender they were, and how not only were they victimized by society, but just being subjected to this carceral system, and how vicious jail is.
The teens continue to insist they are innocent, and as the case fades from the public eye, experts begin to wonder if justice was truly served.
These cases were so questionable because the DNA evidence right away showed that none of them had anything to do with it.
Today, if you have a suspect, they take that suspect's DNA and they match it to the DNA at the crime scene, and if they don't match, the suspect is let go. But here you have a case, you have 5 suspects that police say raped and beat this woman. Their semen is not found at that crime scene. Yet, the semen of someone is found at that crime scene, and it's not any one of those 5 boys. How do you explain that?
The authorities assumed there was an extra person who was not caught. None of them actually confessed to another person because that other person they did not know or did not exist.
DNA isn't the only inconsistency that comes under scrutiny.
According to the location where these young people were and how they moved around the park, it would have been impossible to be in so many locations at the same time.
They had a map of the park, and they had Patricia Mealy's movements and where she was accosted and where the boys were and where they were eventually caught. They never intersected. So based on the accepted movements of her and them, they could not have done it.
At the time of the attack, news coverage focused solely on the evidence against the 5 boys, ignoring anything that might have proven their innocence.
It was the police pushing the story about the confessions. What's interesting to me is that when I went and looked back at the case, what was clear was that most of the news articles, and this is a decision being made in the newsroom now, decided to minimize the significance of the reports that there were problems with the confessions.
The only people in my adult life who I've seen vilified like them would be Saddam Hussein, right? Or Timothy McVeigh, or a Jeffrey Dahmer, right? They made these young brothers look like terrorists and serial killers.
According to the 5, they each went to the park that night to hang out and got caught up in the larger group. When things escalated into violence and the police showed up, they tried to run. Most of the crowd escaped, but the 5 boys weren't so lucky.
I think that there were a lot of kids in the park. Not everybody was beating up people. And my understanding is, and my belief is, that none of these 5 hit anybody. They may have been in that group of kids type thing, but I don't think that any of the Central Park 5 participated in any of the violence that night.
They really didn't have a chance because they were not going to be allowed to be found innocent. It was, given the way the media coverage occurred and this close collaboration between the media and the police and the prosecutor's office, an innocent verdict would have seemed nonsensical.
For more than a decade, they would remain convicted felons until someone else comes forward to claim responsibility for the crime.
Can you imagine serving 10, 12, whatever the sentence was, and you're encountered with the guy that did it?
The Central Park 5 spend the rest of their childhoods behind bars. Because they continue to claim their innocence, they're repeatedly denied parole.
Well, the 4 youngest boys, they serve approximately 7 years in prison before they are released. During the years of incarceration, some of them were able to earn their GEDs or college degrees, but they did find it was kind of difficult to sort of get back to society upon their release. In the minds of the people, these are men convicted of brutally beating and raping a woman.
But public opinion about these young men is about to change. It starts with an inmate named Matias Reyes.
In terms of Matias Reyes, from the point of view of a journalist in the city at that time, he was the East Side rapist.
He is serving his life sentence on the strength of the fact that he stabbed and murdered a pregnant woman.
Shortly after his arrest in August of 1989, Reyes had a run-in with Corey Wise on Rikers Island.
At some point during their stay at Rikers Island, Reyes and Corey Wise, they have a bit of an altercation in one of the rooms where there's a TV that the inmates can watch.
The two would meet again 13 years later in a different facility.
Reyes went up to him and says, dude, I don't know if you remember, we got into this fight years ago at Rikers over the television. I just want to apologize to you. And Corey Wise says, man, we're here. It's okay, we're here. You know, let's just do our time. And Reyes said that, looking at Corey Wise, it affected him. It affected him. He realized, you know what? I got to put an end to this.
After their reconciliation, Reyes contacts the district attorney to make a startling confession. Reyes says he knows Corey is innocent because he is the one who raped the jogger that night.
And you had sex with her?
Yes.
You're clear?
Not sex, I raped her.
Okay.
In his confession to authorities, Reyes revealed to investigators information that investigators had never revealed, information that only the perpetrator would have known.
What was it like where you ended up with her?
A small little pregnancy.
A small little what?
A small little bridge. That's a little further away.
He said, you know, those boys didn't do anything. I never saw those boys that night. Never saw them ever in my life. Ultimately, Reyes gives a full confession. Police match his DNA against the DNA first discovered at the crime scene in April 1989. And guess what? Reyes' DNA matches the semen left inside the body of Trisha Maley. And combined with the DNA evidence, those statements that Reyes made convinced authorities that he, in fact, was the lone perpetrator of this assault. And now they had a big problem on their hands because they had 5 people that were wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for this crime.
After reviewing the evidence, the New York Supreme Court vacates the convictions of the Central Park Five.
That doesn't happen every day. There are times when convictions get overturned, but that's often different than being exonerated. Being exonerated means you are factually innocent of the crime.
On the personal sense, I was happy and thrilled for them. And, you know, this voice inside going, I knew it, I knew it. And then there was also this sadness.
Here's the thing. You stole lives. You stole time. You don't understand what potential they took from these people, right? The impact on the families, relatives dying while you're in jail, mothers crying, people suffering.
A year later, the young men file a civil lawsuit against the city for malicious prosecution and racial discrimination.
In conjunction with the filing of this lawsuit, there was a review of the performance of the police and prosecutors in the original 1989 investigation, and it was concluded by the city of New York that the police and prosecutors did nothing wrong.
There was a refusal to accept that a wrong was done, and there were a lot of political careers that were made off of this case, names that were very well known in New York City, and that might have had something to do with it.
It would take more than a decade for the case to be settled.
Slowly, the drumbeat got louder and louder, and more information started coming out, and it was people fully begun to understand that this is a wrong that had to be corrected.
And it wasn't until after the current New York City Mayor, Bill de Blasio, was elected and inaugurated that the funds were released. The $41 million was released to the Central Park Five in 2014.
The reasoning was $1 million for every year that the boys collectively spent in prison or in jail.
The case may have finally been closed, but the fallout and the controversy would continue for years to come. After the settlement in 2014, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio calls for the city to turn the page and move forward. But it won't be easy.
The Central Park case was sort of the last straw, but it really was a mark in history that I think you could say, you know, before that, the city was one way, and after that, the city was another.
The Central Park Five would become the subject of several documentaries and a rallying cry for change.
It's been extraordinary to watch them come out, and it doesn't even seem that they harbor the kind of negativity that one could gain by going to their situation. Quite the opposite. It seemed like they harbor a willingness to try to change a system so others don't have to go through it.
But while many New Yorkers celebrate their exonerations, others feel that city leaders rush to judgment.
There are some folks who feel that those men do not deserve one nickel from New York City, who feel that the lawsuit was hasty, who feel that the exoneration should not have happened. Regardless of where we stand, based on all the evidence.
I have questions about Ray's confession, as I think a lot of people do. First and foremost, to me, is this. Why? Why would he come out and confess it all, something he could have clearly gotten away with? I think one of the things that is unclear to me is if any of the other defendants knew him and knew he was there.
What's interesting is that Trisha Maley believes that they did it. She is on record for opposing the exoneration. She is on record for maintaining that those boys participated in the attack in her person that night.
This squarely comes down to who you ask. If you ask any of the investigators on the case, probably if you asked any of the jurors, they would say that their decision to prosecute and the jury's verdict were sound. If you ask the Central Park Five, if you ask their families, if you ask any of the people and representatives involved in the very large civil settlement, whether it was the right thing to do, of course they're going to tell you it was.
Despite the ongoing controversy, the Central Park Five have managed to restart their lives, becoming fathers and husbands, as well as staunch advocates for criminal justice reform.
Richardson lives in New Jersey with his wife and 2 daughters. McCrae lives in Georgia with his wife and 6 children. Raymond Santana lives in Georgia with his teenage daughter. In 2018, he created a clothing company called Park Madison NYC.
I know Yusef Salaam through activism. I see how he carries himself, right? He always carries himself with dignity. Corey Wise is a phenomenal person. What I hear about him in the streets of Harlem and in the Bronx, this is somebody who is buying kids bikes. This is somebody who is giving away food. This is somebody who is truly giving back to the community.
The Central Park Five have been called many things: Waldings, monsters, and even heroes. What they are is undeniably human. Their story has no easy conclusion, just as the issues it raises have no easy answers.
Even though it was, a headline grabber, media sensation, this case affected many people in a profound way.
People always say, well, you need to just cooperate with the police. Well, they cooperated with the police and they ended up in jail. They ended up exploited. They ended up with their lives ruined.
The system is massively stacked against people of color, Blacks and Latinos in particular. And the bias against them at the various levels of the system have to be addressed if we're even to talk about the United States existing as a type of multiracial democracy.
A lot of folks will say this is not, when these things happen, this is not who we are. Except it actually is. It's very much who America has always been. I'm proud to be a part of America that always has pushed back on that and tried to make sure the country lives up to what it says it's supposed to, because that's real too, and that's what gives me some perpetual pragmatic hope.
How do you prevent cases like the Exonerated Five? You build stronger Black communities. Because if we're strong and unified, we can achieve anything.
At its height, Detroit was one of the most powerful and culturally influential cities in the world.
You have a lot of hard-working, middle-class workers in the city of Detroit. There's a lot of pride here about where we came as a people. When I say we, I mean African Americans, because the city of Detroit is primarily African American, one of the largest African American cities in the country.
Detroit's reputation as an African American powerhouse took off in the early 1900s after Henry Ford launched his automotive empire in the city, attracting black workers from all over the South.
Henry Ford is saying he's going to offer $5 a day not just to white workers, but to all workers, which factories didn't do. So now you got an influx. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans will end up in the city of Detroit.
Supported by a foundation of high-paying jobs, Detroit's African American communities flourished, and so did the city's music scene. Detroit's business districts began to brim with entertainment halls and jazz clubs.
It was Duke Ellington. It was Count Basie. It was Benny Goodman. We don't think of jazz today as a popular form of music, but that's what it was in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s.
By the 1960s, Detroit's music scene had become world famous, due in large part to one of its most acclaimed musicians and producers.
Or soul, as it's called, is something that you feel from within and you do it spontaneously.
Motown Records was founded in 1959 as Tamla Records by Berry Gordy. Detroit was already known as Motor City. Another word for city is town, so Motor Town. He put those two words together, shortened motor to mo, and town, Motown.
From Michigan's Motortown, a new export was added to cars, the Detroit sound.
Motown Records would go on to sign some of the greatest names in music, from the Jackson 5 to Stevie Wonder and the Supremes.
You have one of the first African Americans to make a global impact in pop music. This wasn't a small town operation. When you think about all the components of Motown, the writers, the photographers, the stylists, this was a full-fledged record label that's just as big as Capitol or Virgin or any major record label right now.
But in 1972, Motown Records was relocated to California, dealing a major blow to Detroit's culture. Then, Ford Motors began moving its factories out of the city as well, ushering in an era of unprecedented poverty and unemployment. By the 1980s, this once proud city had been brought to its knees.
The reality of Detroit in the 1980s, it was the middle of the crack era. It was ruthless, it was rough. You know, every neighborhood, it seemed like, had a crack house.
And of course, if you got drugs, illegal narcotics, and a lot of money, you're gonna have a lot of violence.
Detroit got a reputation as the murder city. And that reputation continued through the 80s and into the 90s.
Out of that turmoil, a new genre of music would emerge.
During the 90s, during the 2000s, Detroit was heavily involved in the rap industry, heavily involved in hip hop. A lot of great artists have come out of Detroit.
There's D12. And also along this time period, there's Race to 5'9". There's Slum Village, who by 2000, 2001, I believe they're on their second album, Fantastic Voyage.
Rappers who are talking about things that are going on in the street. This are guns, drugs, money, thing. That becomes central in Detroit's hip hop.
Well, say, hey, I'm rapping about what I know. Drive-by shootings, crack houses, witnessing murders at young ages. And so when they say hip hop was born from concrete, these are the examples that they're referring to, because like black people like we do, we can take the scraps and we can make something beautiful out of it.
But in 2005, One of Detroit's most promising young rappers is brutally murdered in broad daylight, exposing a sinister plot of revenge and retribution that demands his silence, no matter the cost. On April 19, 2005, Detroit police are called to the scene of a shooting at a car wash on the west side. They find a silver Range Rover that's been riddled with bullets.
We had some responding units to make the 7 Mile and Falls area near the car wash. They encountered a large crowd that had already gathered at a scene that's fairly difficult to contain.
The driver is unharmed, but the man in the passenger seat isn't as lucky.
He sustained multiple gunshot wounds. It was apparent that the passenger had lost his life already.
When police identify the man, the reason for the crowd becomes clear. The victim is 28-year-old rapper Darnell Lindsay, better known to his fans as Blade Icewood.
You're talking about one of the most pivotal rap figures in Detroit history here. You're talking about someone who was well known by the community.
Blade just had the streets a lot. I mean, everybody wanted to know him or lie about being related to him, you know? Like, he was one of the biggest celebrities out.
Darnell Quincy Lindsay was born on March 14, 1977. His love for music was apparent from childhood.
I wanted him to grow up to be maybe lawyer, doctor, whatever, this big tycoon, you know. But it was, I guess, in the cards for him to go into music.
He got involved in the rap game at a very young age. He wasn't just one of those, it was just a trendy thing. He knew what he wanted to do, and he put his mind on it and to it. He would talk about, hey, I'm gonna have that cheddar one day. I will make that money. He was always known as that type of person, someone who would be successful.
He was writing raps, and it was just a different twist to it, the way he delivered it to the people.
My dad talked about anything from the hardship to the glory of it to the fancy things to back when times was hard. Just anything, like touched on all angles.
He always came to me to ask me my opinion because he knew that I would tell him the truth, good or bad, you know. So if it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. The first time he came to me, he was like, I want you to hear this. So I said, okay. And I told him, I said, it doesn't sound too good. So back to the drawing board he went, you know. And the next time he came back, it sounded good. The beat was on, the words were good. And I told him, I said, okay, I think people will listen to this.
Darnell quickly rose in popularity, becoming known throughout Detroit by his stage name, Blade Icewood. That's when he started working with a rap group called the Street Lords.
The Street Lords, they were a lot of members from all across the city. And so he was the center of that. He ended up gaining that notoriety because people were instantly drawn to him and his music was just right on point.
Blade Icewood was not the first Detroit hip-hop artist to bring raw street content to the mic. But he was one of the first to do it with flair.
From jewelry and the buffs and the rollies, you know, that all started with Blade Icewood and what him and the Street Lords brought to the game, something new that wasn't around before.
To this day, everyone does the Blade dance. The Blade dance was made popular in one of his videos. 2 fists up and in motion coming down. You'll see that commonly with football players. They'll do it when they hit the end zone. You'll see it with basketball players.
In Detroit, you can't fake it. They're gonna be able to tell. And how real he was made everybody just gravitated toward him. And he was representing at a time where we didn't have many people representing for us and telling the Detroit story.
And at the time, you had a strong push of Detroit rap making its way, and you had a whole community of people under the impression that Blade was gonna be the one to take Detroit, put it on the map.
But now, this promising young artist has been violently gunned down in broad daylight, and police begin the grim task of securing the scene.
When officers arrived, they would have seen Blade seated in his silver Range Rover, seated in the passenger seat. He was seated in an upright position. He sustained a substantial amount of gunshot wounds. They immediately started looking around the area to see what kind of evidence they need to preserve, and they seen the shell casings around the car. The positioning of the shell casings shows how the shooter moved in the direction to get better angles.
The manner, timing, and location of the shooting all suggest whoever shot Blade had come looking for him.
7 Mile is a very busy thoroughfare, and it's fairly open. That tells you that this was something intentionally done in public.
In other words, Blade's death appeared to be a straight-up execution.
The scene told that somebody approached this vehicle that had exact knowledge of who was in the vehicle, and they approached that vehicle knowing that they were going to attempt a shooting.
7 Mile is an area of Detroit that has seen a lot of violence over the years, but the death of local rapper Blade Icewood has left the neighborhood in shock.
When we heard that Blade Icewood was shot, there was, uproar in the community.
Didn't matter what side of town you were from, you knew exactly who this was. Blade was one of the most pivotal figures in Detroit rap. You know, this was someone who was poised to push Detroit rap mainstream, push it out to the rest of the nation.
It was almost like the President of the United States had passed. Even if you didn't listen to his music, you were just starting to get caught on to one song or two because he had radio too. And to hear of his passing, it was kind of like you lost an uncle or you lost a big brother.
It was like people calling people and like swarms of people coming. It was just crazy. It was like Tupac or somebody had died. I was just crushed because not only was he my friend, it was a very big thing for Detroit to lose Blade, for sure. It was definitely hard on us and super hard on his family.
We got a phone call. His dad was here and I heard him scream. It was like a scream I had never heard before, and I'm like, what's the matter? What happened? I went up there and I was talking to the police and I said, I just want to see him one more time. And they were like, no, we can't let you go over there.
At that point, the officers are there to secure the scene as best as they can so that once the homicide detectives arrive and the units from Crime Scene Services, they can document everything as best as possible.
Witnesses say they recognized the musician's vehicle the moment it showed up at the car wash. And apparently, so did the shooter, who approached the passenger side where Blade was sitting.
There were variations in the actual physical description, but a male of average height, lighter complected. A lot of them said that he was stocky in stature. He was clothed in like some kind of brown pants. Some people described it as like khakis, like Carhartt, or a jogging suit. There were some reports that he just walked up and started shooting. And there were reports that there was a conversation or argument that ensued. And that was never really cleared up.
Police determined the gunman fired a total of 17 rounds. That many shots suggested that Blade's murder wasn't a robbery or a case of mistaken identity. It was an assassination. And as police soon discover, this isn't the first time someone had tried to take Blade's life.
In September 2004, he was at his home in Oak Park, relaxing. Well, there was a home invasion. Someone breaks in, 2 guys, and unfortunately, he's shot multiple times. It's no doubt they meant to leave him for dead. He was meant to be killed.
He described it in his own words that, he was shot with a K. That's not normally the weaponry that someone going in to steal something is going to carry around. AK-47 is a terrifying weapon. It does maximum damage from minimal rounds.
Based on the weapon used, police believed from the beginning this was no ordinary home invasion.
Just looking at that, you can surmise that it was a home invasion by definition, but they were going in there for a total different reason.
Although Blade survived the assault, his injuries were extensive.
He took a significant amount of rounds in that shooting.
Unfortunately, he was left paralyzed from the waist down.
Doctors told Blade he would never walk again.
He said he'd rather be dead. He was like, Mom, you just don't know how I feel. The devastation that he experienced, you feel like half a person because half of you are gone,
At the time, there was speculation that Blade knew his attackers, but he refused to divulge their names to investigators. If he did, he risked being branded a snitch in the streets. something that could have destroyed his credibility amongst his fans.
He was respecting the street code by not speaking to police. You know, no one wanted to snitch. And so Blade himself, he didn't want to talk about it.
Because Blade refused to break the code, the motive behind why he was being targeted was just as elusive as the identity of his attackers.
And so unfortunately, no justice was done. No one was charged with the offense. No one was brought to justice in that shooting. Blade did speak about it in his music.
He made reference to the amount of shots he took from the rifle, the type of rifle it was.
And he spoke about, look, I know what you did. You attempted to kill me, but I am still here, and I will continue to be here.
Like one of his songs say, Mama say, keep your head up. And he kept it up, you know, and he continued to write. You do not let anyone take you down. No one, you know. You keep moving forward.
That attitude and spirit about it was just indicative of the overarching spirit of the city, you know. And that added to the whole lure of Blade Icewood.
Although he was confined to a wheelchair, the experience gave Blade new insight and inspiration.
Here was this underground rapper in the city of Detroit talking about how tough it is, and he recognized that, wait a minute, Detroit is known as the murder city. That's a bad rap. We need to do something about this in the community at a time when the mayor didn't know what to do about it, police didn't know what to do about it, communities didn't know what to do about it. And so he held a nonviolence rally.
The rally was called the 7 Mile Stop the Violence Rally, and Blade was one of the headlining performers.
You had a local rapper hold an anti-violence rally. That was powerful. And so that rally meant a lot to the entire city, not just East Siders, West Siders, Southwest Detroit, northern part of Detroit. It meant a lot to the city. And so people respected him for that.
Now, just 1 year later, Blade has become a victim of the very violence he spoke out against. And it appears whoever tried to kill Blade before may have finally finished what they started.
I just had a feeling something was going to happen. And I just had this pit in my stomach.
You know, in the back of his mind and in the back of his family's minds and friends, they knew that there was a shooter still out there. And there was that fear that one day that person could come back. And unfortunately for Blade Icewood, that was true.
As Detroit police search for the gunman who killed Blade Icewood, loved ones and supporters gather at his funeral to mourn their loss.
At his service, I was like, who are all these people? Older people, even school teachers came. It was like, you know, I get these stories of kindness that he's displayed to people, and it just made me feel good.
I only spent 5 years of my life with him, so I can't really remember my dad. You know, I was so young, you know, but I hear all the stories, you know, I can only imagine.
It was a huge memorial. Everyone mourned the death of an iconic rapper who meant so much to the community.
When we lost Blade, we also lost a piece of the city. And with that comes a desert town, like just flatline. It definitely was grief. I mean, loss of life is an emotion that you don't always know how to deal with. So imagine a whole city to have to feel that.
And what was even tougher is at that moment, no one knew if we would ever know who the shooter was.
When investigators tried to question locals about the case, however, they're met with the same wall of silence that Blade had stood behind after his first shooting.
You had a lot of witnesses at the scene who observed things that were reluctant to come forward, especially on the scene.
The same fear Blade had of being labeled a snitch was the same fear that kept many witnesses from speaking up. There was also a healthy distrust of police in general.
The community had a lot of distrust of the police, and that was throughout the country. The African-American community and its relationship with police and law enforcement has never been a positive thing. Oftentimes people in poor neighborhoods in the city of Detroit or cities that were similar felt that, hey, the police, they don't care about what's going on in the communities and poor communities. So sometimes people thought, hey, let's deal with justice between ourselves because the police didn't care.
In the absence of any suspects, the media runs its own narrative.
We're talking about early 2000s. We're talking about a young black man from the city of Detroit, a rapper, and people typically would want to or try to affiliate rap with negativity. The media, you know, when you had one black person kill another black person, unfortunately sometimes they wanted to instantly make it gang related.
Gang related, I think, is always an oversimplification, and particularly in Detroit, because, you know, people that grew up together, they're not really gangs in the sense that you would think of, like maybe you might encounter on the West Coast or in places like that where that kind of gang culture is popular.
Blade wasn't never in no gang. They be trying to make the rap groups and labels seem like they're a gang, but that wasn't the case. It was never a gang. It was just a record label with some artists.
But when the lie or the falsehood is sensationalized, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And so that theory ran and ran and ran.
It's tough and it does a lot of damage. We lose the human side and what he meant to his family. This man was a father and he was a husband. He wasn't this, you know, person doing these negative things.
How do I feel about people speculating, writing misrepresentation of my son's life? It angers me at times. The narrative itself was speculation. Whoever did their research did not research too well. The drug-related murder, the street gang murder.
False narratives create false narratives, and they also create long-lasting tension. So you get further and further away from the truth, and it's harder to come back.
Even though he's being dragged in the media, on the streets, Blade's death only amplifies his legacy.
So there was a moment where you had to grieve, but then there was the moment of I want to make Blade proud now. So then you saw a lot of artists trying to like recreate some of his music or the things that he made, or oh man, I can't imagine how many people reached out to his family to see if they had a verse laying around.
Blade's story was not over. There was a level of superstardom, another level of national notoriety that was on his horizon that he was going to get to.
But as police take a closer look at the previous shooting that left Blade paralyzed, they find his notoriety might have been the very thing that got him killed.
As Blade's career started to explode, it's early 2004. He's being nominated for awards throughout the city, best rapper, best album, best song. He's experiencing the life. But unfortunately, there were people out there who were very jealous. As he grew in fame, he became a target. The haters came out, as they would say.
Blade had Detroit on his back, the city as a whole, and so that added that additional layer of complexity to the investigation.
I told him, if you get around people that are jealous of you, they will try to shut you down. There's no doubt in my mind.
The evidence suggested there was a rivalry going on and there was some bad blood.
So far, Detroit police have been unable to identify any of the gunmen who had targeted Blade Icewood. But another fatal shooting in the rap community back in 2004 provides them with one of their first solid leads.
So 2 days prior to Blade Icewood being shot multiple times in his home in September 2004, you had another local rapper called Wipeout, and he was actually shot as well.
Downtown Detroit, there was a club. It was the Club Excess. Wipeout had come back to the city from Atlanta, and he was at this party at the club. The information that's there from that case shows that there was some kind of altercation, an argument outside of the club. And pretty much shortly thereafter, you had shots fired, and he was struck and killed. There were witness accounts that Blade's truck was at the scene. It was even alleged that he may have been one of the people firing shots. A short time later, there was a home invasion at Blade's home where he was struck with gunfire. He himself wasn't cooperative in the investigation, but they identified who they thought might have been involved, and it was someone who was also an associate of Wipeout.
Since Blade survived that attack, perhaps his attackers decided to come back and finish the job. The theory gains traction when investigators learn Wipeout was associated with a rival rap group.
In the early 2000s, when Street Lords and Cheddar Boys became a Detroit phenomenon. And then there was a group called the East Side Cheddar Boys. And so you had these two groups.
I'm the original Cheddar Boy. Original Cheddar Boy and Chief Cheddar.
So Blade Icewood, though he was a part of the Street Lords, he often referred to himself as the original Cheddar Boy. And, well, that was fine, but there was an East Side group that used the name Cheddar Boys as well. And so that sort of caused a conflict.
Who the real Cheddar Boys? You know, who the original? Who was the first? People may look at that like, well, why does it matter who was the original? And it's like, for a city that always feels under pressure, you get a lot of negative press, it kind of gives you that chip on your shoulder. It was a war of words, but the war of words had cultural implications, and it also had street implications.
They're using part of my name, and they didn't want the confusion in the streets. I don't think the average person on a national level would know the difference. But here locally, we definitely understood what the conflict was about.
We're not just talking about sticks and stones break my bones with words that never hurt me. Like, we talking about the sticks and stones and the words, and they all are, you know, tied together in this instance.
Over the years, Blade, Street Lords, and the rival East Side Cheddar Boys had released a number of songs taking shots at each other. But it seems Blade might have taken things a little too far.
We knew that Blade had words with multiple people about his music. He had done diss songs, right? So we knew there were words with others.
He definitely boasted about it in the music. Made references to what some would believe was the shooting of Wipeout down at Access. As law enforcement, you look at that information, it's not something that you're gonna take in front of a prosecutor to get a warrant signed, but it is important to take that information in and put it in this place, in this puzzle that we're trying to put together, because it is a piece.
However, despite the public feud between the Street Lords and the East Side Cheddar Boys, there's no evidence of any violence between the two groups.
There was no doubt that there were people out there who were jealous, who wanted him dead, who did not care for Blade Icewood. But there was never any overt gang activity between Blade Icewood and the Street Lords or the Cheddar Boys versus someone else. In order to connect that, you would have to connect that Blade was somehow tied into Wipeout's shooting, which he wasn't. That was never corroborated by the police or any law enforcement agency.
The truth, what my son told me, Mom, I did not do anything to anybody. And I believed him. I believed him.
As the East Side Cheddar Boys are concerned, the rivalry was overblown. They claim they had nothing to do with Blade's death.
Some of it was in fun, right? Because that's how the rap world is sometimes. It's music, it's fiction a lot of times.
It's been said that Dad had reached a resolution before he passed away.
And so whether justice would ever be served, the family was probably very afraid at that time whether or not they would ever learn who the shooter was.
But investigators get a lucky break when the gun used to kill Blade turns up 1,000 miles away.
The gun that killed my son was actually found in Texas. Ballistics matched, all of it.
That firearm became a central part of the investigation because the caliber of firearm matched the caliber of the shell casings recovered at Blade's scene.
And there was very powerful evidence tied.
The entire city of Detroit is busy fighting against the narrative that his murder was somehow gang-related.
You see black on black crime, you instantly want to say it's gang-related. This has been perpetuated for 20 years, but what people don't see it as, and what Detroiters do see it as, is this was a sin against the city and a sin against the community. And the reason why is when you perpetuate narratives like that, it marginalizes a community.
For investigators, the real motive behind why Blade was targeted in both shootings has been elusive, thanks to the code of silence permeating Detroit. But as the case drags on, a few brave souls find themselves willing to come forward with new information despite the risks.
Detectives just continued to piece the puzzle together, and the community really started filtering in with their information and adding to it.
As tips finally begin to roll in, one name eventually rises to the top. a notorious criminal known as Little Larry Davidson.
So Little Larry Davidson, just as his name kind of says, just 5'2", short guy. You know, you would never take him as a street thug or someone tough. Had a reputation in the community as a hitman. But the community definitely understood his reputation and how, you know, this was someone you did not want to cross.
It was reported that he had known Blade in childhood and grew up together. What was important to the detectives is that they were able to start digging into Larry Davidson's background and seeing what he was, you know, into. And they were able to move him from like a person of interest onto a suspect.
He broke into someone's home and he was involved in what was called assault with intent to murder with multiple people. He did a drive-by, pulled up on another vehicle and shot up that vehicle. A young lady was hurt and injured in that vehicle. All of this occurred within a week or 2 week period of Blade Icewood being murdered.
And now witnesses say Davidson has been boasting about the shooting.
You had some eyewitnesses who overheard Little Larry, for example, in a barbershop say, just a couple weeks prior, "I'm going to get Blade."
This is a person that was hired to kill other people.
And so law enforcement and prosecutors were convinced that Little Larry Davidson was possibly paid or hired to kill Blade.
Apprehending Davidson proves to be difficult, but not impossible.
Due to some good investigative work, they were able to track him down to an address in Texas. He had received some falsified documents and was actually able to secure a Texas driver's license. His girlfriend, who was doing a very good job of hiding, but these guys were on it and they got down there and they were able to interview her. And during the course of that interview, they became aware that the firearm was still around. And they actually recovered the firearm.
Davidson himself, however, is harder to track down. Detectives receive intel that he's actually back in Detroit, awaiting a flight out of the city.
He was stopped at Detroit Metro Airport right before boarding a Northwest Airlines flight back to Killeen, Texas.
Detroit police charged Davidson with a slew of charges, from home invasion to multiple murders, including Blade Icewood.
He would just kill anybody. You know, it didn't matter to him. From the record that the police showed me, they showed me that he had actually killed like 8 people, you know, and my son just so happened to be one of them.
The question is, who hired him?
When law enforcement looked into, you know, who hired Little Larry, they couldn't figure that out.
It was alleged that he was paid $10,000 to kill Blade Icewood. It wasn't something that we were ever able to prove. We never got that far to even know who it was supposed to be paid by.
What his reasoning was, we don't know. But we knew that he was, you know, involved in multiple shootings, multiple murders, and ultimately police were convinced that, yes, this was the killer.
Even with the murder weapon, however, prosecutors worry they won't have enough evidence to convict him.
As a prosecutor, this is what we consider a very tough case, right? Circumstantial evidence. You didn't have any direct evidence. You didn't have any witnesses who say, I saw Little Larry shoot Blade Icewood. You didn't have video of it. And a lot of forensic evidence at that time did not exist. And so the prosecutors had to build a case, and it was very thin.
In 2006, 1 year after legendary Detroit rapper Blade Icewood was murdered, the trial for his accused killer, Little Larry Davidson, finally gets underway. Prosecutors are hoping the jury can look past the lack of direct evidence to see the bigger picture.
He had circumstantial hearsay evidence, right, of someone saying, well, I heard Little Larry say he was involved in that September shooting of Blade Icewood. You had another witness say that he talked about, I am going to get Blade. And so those pieces of evidence taken together told a story. Most importantly was the gun. So Little Larry in these other offenses used a .45 caliber weapon, black weapon, which witnesses described in those other incidents, which was the same type of weapon that killed Blade Icewood. ultimately, they were able to tie that weapon and gun to the shooting and murder of Blade Icewood.
Notably, the gang narrative that's been dominating the media is never mentioned during the proceedings.
This was a hit on Blade Icewood's life. And Little Larry did this. This wasn't drug related, it was not gang related. This was a hitman who was on a mission to kill Blade Icewood.
We could ask why somebody would choose to take another life all day long, and only Larry Davidson really knows that information.
On April 6th, the jury provides its verdict.
So Little Larry, despite the very thin evidence in Blade Icewood's case, he was convicted.
As far as God answering my prayer, it was all concluded because the guy that bragged about doing that, he's incarcerated the rest of his life. He received life with no possible parole.
So it's very safe to say he will never come out of prison or see the streets ever again.
The shooting that paralyzed Blade remains unsolved. It is still unknown if Little Larry Davidson was one of the gunmen that night, or if he only became involved later to finish the job.
We'll probably never know whether the two shooting incidents were related at all. But people, when you have one shooting and then another, people are gonna talk. I mean, to this day, some people are adamant, no, they were related.
In the years since Blade Icewood's murder, rumors have continued to swirl about the true reason for it. But one thing is certain, Blade's legacy lives on in Motor City.
I didn't fully understand the impact of Blade's death until years later as I started writing about more of the newer hip-hop artists. The men who were teens when Blade passed away, and you ask them who were they listening to, who was the inspiration, and they say Blade Icewood.
Blade Icewood is a hero. Street Lords are heroes to me because they all came before me, and it's all a chain reaction. If the Blade never happens, then the next thing never happens. Then when it's time for me to do my thing, it's impossible, So a huge amount of respect for Blade Icewood.
There are people that lost a piece of themselves that day when he passed away. There's a generation that can tell you what they were doing when they heard JFK die. Well, there are people here that can tell you to the second to the minute what they were doing when word reached to them that Blade Icewood had passed away.
He meant a lot to Detroit. He meant a lot culturally, and now you see his impact 20 years later, nationally, the impact that he had.
And Blade's ultimate legacy is his son, an aspiring rapper and producer who performs under the stage name Lil Blade.
There's no bringing Blade back, but you can have a Lil Blade remix 2.0, got his own flavor.
I am the son of Blade Icewood. It's definitely hard living up to a legend, but as time goes on, it just becomes a part of your daily life, I hope my father would be very proud of me because I put in a lot of hard work, and I definitely didn't take the easy route with this. My goal is just take it to heights he wasn't able to take it to.
What made the Blade story so much sadder is how close he was to national success. Like it was right around the corner. And not only would that have been changed his life and everybody around him, it would have changed the city forever too.
Once you're legend, you're legend. The impact is never dying. The music never dies. The influence doesn't die. We lost him in the body, but he's still here in the spirit.
I just miss him, period. I've listened to a lot of his music since he's no longer here, just to hear his voice. But the legacy living on and on and on, and all these people loving him, still listening to the music. He did what he set out to do. He really did, and he made his mother proud. He really did.